A cat jumping over a corpse. The family curse. Chapter 1. Summary. In a remote, superstitious village, a family gathers to mourn the passing of their patriarch, Mr. Graham. Amid their grief, unresolved family conflicts bubble to the surface, leading to an explosive confrontation during the wake. As a violent storm rages outside, a black cat, a harbinger of doom, leaps over the coffin, triggering a series of eerie and unexplainable events. When Mr. Graham's corpse seemingly returns to life, terror engulfs the mourners. The priest's attempts to quell the supernatural disturbance reveal the true extent of the curse that has befallen the family. What follows is a horrifying ordeal where guilt, betrayal, and the power of the unknown intertwine. The once peaceful home becomes a battlefield between the living and the undead, with the black cat serving as a silent, menacing witness. By dawn, the family is left shattered, and the village elders vow to bury the night's events in silence. But for Lily, the patriarch's daughter, the curse lingers like a shadow, threatening to destroy what remains of her fractured family. This chilling tale explores the consequences of familial betrayal and the eerie folklore surrounding death and its uneasy boundaries. Part 1. A village in mourning. The village lay shrouded in mist, nestled in the embrace of ancient woods that whispered of forgotten secrets. Here, in this remote place steeped in superstition, the Graham family mourned the passing of its patriarch, Mr. Graham. The old man's life had been one of resilience and quiet strength, but now his absence left a gaping void, heavy with sorrow. The mourners gathered at the Graham household, a modest structure with wooden beams creaking under the weight of time and memories. The air was thick with the scent of incense and rain-soaked earth. Shadows danced on the walls as candle flames flickered, casting eerie shapes that seemed almost alive. The wailing of women blended with the mournful howls of the wind, creating a symphony of grief. Lily, the eldest daughter, knelt by her father's lifeless body. Her trembling hands clasped his cold ones, and tears streaked her pale cheeks. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking, "how will we go on without you?" In the corner, Marcus, her younger brother, stood with his fists clenched. His disheveled appearance and bloodshot eyes betrayed the turmoil within. He had arrived late, reeking of alcohol, his steps unsteady. The tension between him and Lily's husband, David, was a palpable undercurrent that threatened to erupt at any moment. The village priest, Father Samuel, entered the room, his presence commanding yet subdued. He carried a rosary and a small vial of holy water, his face a mask of solemnity. "Let us pray for Mr. Graham's soul," he said, his voice steady. The mourners formed a circle around the coffin, their whispered prayers mingling with the rustling leaves outside. As the prayers continued, a storm began to brew. The first drops of rain splattered against the tin roof, a prelude to the downpour that followed. Thunder growled in the distance, and lightning illuminated the room in fleeting bursts, each flash revealing the strained faces of the grieving family. Amid the growing storm, Marcus's resentment boiled over. "Is this what we've become?" he spat, his voice cutting through the prayers. "Pretending everything is fine when this family has fallen apart." Lily rose, her tear-streaked face hardening. "Not now, Marcus. This is neither the time nor the place." When then Marcus shot back, his voice trembling with anger. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? While I've been drowning, you've been playing house, acting like father's favorite." David stepped forward, his jaw set. "Enough, Marcus. Show some respect." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Respect? Coming from you?" The man who stopped Lily's voice cracked like a whip. She turned to Father Samuel. "Please continue the prayers." The priest nodded, his calm demeanor barely concealing his unease. But before he could speak, a loud crash startled everyone. The sacrificial table, adorned with offerings, had toppled over, spilling candles and flowers onto the floor. Gasps filled the room as a black cat emerged from the shadows. Its sleek fur glistened with rain, and its glowing yellow eyes locked onto the coffin. "The omen," an elderly villager whispered, clutching her chest. "A black cat crossing the dead. It's a sign of unrest." The cat leapt onto the coffin, its presence unnerving. It lingered for a moment, its tail flicking, before darting out into the storm. The room fell silent, the atmosphere heavy with dread. Even Father Samuel looked uneasy as he approached the coffin. "We must proceed with caution," he said, sprinkling holy water on the casket. The mourners exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers barely audible over the storm's crescendo. The night stretched on, each hour more oppressive than the last. As the rain hammered against the windows, the Graham family could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the line between the living and the dead had blurred. And somewhere in the darkness, the black cat's eyes gleamed like twin beacons, watching, waiting. As the hours crawled by, the mourners began to drift away, murmuring hushed goodbyes and offering perfunctory condolences. Lily sat by the coffin, her head bowed, the weight of exhaustion and sorrow pressing down on her. David stood nearby, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, offering silent support. Marcus, meanwhile, had retreated to a corner of the room, a bottle of whiskey clutched tightly in his hand. He stared into the distance, his expression a mixture of anger and despair. "It's all a farce," he muttered under his breath, his words slurring. "He's gone, and we're just pretending." Pretending like it matters. David shot him a warning look. "Not tonight, Marcus. Let it go." Marcus sneered. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one." His voice trailed off, and he took another swig from the bottle. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, the wind howling like a mournful spirit. The candles flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The faint scent of rain and earth seeped into the room, mingling with the aroma of incense and the metallic tang of sorrow. Father Samuel, sensing the unease, began to chant a low, rhythmic prayer, his voice steady and soothing. The words seemed to fill the room, weaving a protective cocoon around the mourners. Yet beneath the surface, an undercurrent of dread persisted, an unshakable feeling that something was terribly wrong. And then it happened. A low guttural sound emanated from the direction of the coffin. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, a rasping, wheezing noise that sent a chill down everyone's spine. Lily's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. David nodded, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but shaken. He stepped forward cautiously, his movements deliberate and slow. Father Samuel stopped chanting, his eyes narrowing as he clutched his rosary tightly. "Everyone, stay back," he commanded, his voice calm but laced with urgency. "Do not approach the coffin." The guttural sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. And then, with a sudden, jarring movement, the lid of the coffin shifted. Gasps and cries erupted from the mourners, and several stumbled backward, their faces masks of terror. Lily clung to David, her body trembling. What's happening?" she stammered, tears streaming down her face. Father Samuel stepped forward, his rosary held aloft. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," he intoned, his voice strong and resolute. "If there is unrest, I command you to be at peace for a moment." The room fell silent, the only sounds the pounding rain and the mourners' ragged breaths. And then, with a deafening creak, the lid of the coffin slid open completely. What lay inside was not the serene, lifeless form of Mr. Graham they had placed there hours ago. His eyes were open, staring blankly into the void, his mouth twisted into a grotesque semblance of a smile. His hands twitched, the fingers curling and uncurling with a mechanical precision that was both unnatural and horrifying. The mourners screamed, scrambling for the door. But Lily remained rooted to the spot, her mind unable to process the scene before her. David pulled her back, shielding her with his body as Father Samuel stepped closer to the coffin. The priest began to pray fervently, his voice rising above the chaos. "Heavenly Father, we seek your protection," but before he could finish, a sudden, inhuman growl erupted from the coffin. Mr. Graham's body convulsed violently, his head snapping toward Marcus, who stood frozen in terror. "You," the voice rasped, low and guttural. It was Mr. Graham's voice, but distorted, otherworldly. "You betrayed me." Marcus staggered backward, his face pale as death. No, I didn't," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, the wind howling like a banshee. The black cat appeared at the window, its glowing eyes fixed on the scene inside. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone present this was no ordinary mourning. This was a reckoning. Part 2. Hidden tensions erupt. The room still hummed with unease from the earlier strange events. The storm outside howled, rattling the shutters and shaking the fragile structure of the Graham household. But inside, the tension between the living began to mount, threatening to break the thin veneer of civility that had held through the wake. Marcus, seated in a darkened corner with a nearly empty bottle of whiskey in hand, glared at the other family members. His bloodshot eyes darted from Lily to her husband, David. Their every movement seemed to fuel his simmering anger. Lily knelt near the coffin, her hands clasped in silent prayer. David stood beside her, ever protective, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. Marcus sneered and broke the silence. "Praying won't fix this family. Nothing will." His voice, slurred but sharp, cut through the room like a knife. Lily lifted her head slowly, her tear-streaked face now hardened. "This isn't the time, Marcus." "When is the time?" he snapped, his voice rising. "When we bury another lie with Father. Pretend everything's fine, like always." David turned, his calm exterior cracking. "Marcus, stop, you're drunk. You need to sit down and keep your mouth shut." Marcus rose unsteadily, his towering frame swaying but intimidating. "Don't talk to me like that," he spat. "You don't get to preach to me, David. You married into this family. You're just an outsider pretending to care." David stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "I've done more for this family than you ever have. While you were out drinking, gambling, and wasting your life, I was here, supporting Lily, supporting your father." Marcus's laugh was cold and bitter. "Supporting? Is that what you call it? Sucking up to Father for your own gain? That's enough." Lily stood abruptly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Both of you. How dare you turn this night into a circus? Father's body isn't even in the ground, and you're already tearing each other apart." But Marcus wasn't finished. He pointed a shaking finger at Lily, his voice laced with venom. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? The dutiful daughter, the favorite. But you're just as much a liar as the rest of us." Lily flinched, the accusation hitting a nerve. "I've done nothing but try to keep this family together," she said, her voice breaking. "Unlike you, who only shows up when it's convenient. You don't know anything about me." Marcus roared, his anger spilling over. "I was the one Father relied on when things got tough. I was the one who, what?" David interjected. "Ran away, left your father to pick up the pieces while you drowned in self-pity. You're a disgrace, Marcus." The room fell deathly silent, the air thick with hostility. Marcus lunged forward, but several mourners stepped in, pulling him back. His wild eyes darted between Lily and David, his chest heaving. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You never understood him like I did." "Enough," Marcus' father Samuel said firmly, stepping between the two men. "This is not the time for such quarrels. Let us remember Mr. Graham." With dignity, Marcus shrugged off the hands restraining him and sank back into his chair, seething but subdued. His muttered curses filled the uneasy silence as Lily wiped her tears and returned to her place beside the coffin. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind screaming as if echoing the turmoil inside the house. David placed a reassuring hand on Lily's shoulder, but she didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the coffin, her mind replaying Marcus's accusations. Could there be a sliver of truth in his words? Had she, in her quest to keep the family together, overlooked her brother's pain? The black cat reappeared, its silhouette stark against the window. Its glowing eyes watched the scene inside, unblinking and unnerving. As the rain battered the glass, it seemed to wait, its presence a silent reminder that something darker loomed on the horizon. Father Samuel resumed his prayers, his voice steady but strained. Yet the atmosphere refused to lighten. The mourners exchanged nervous glances, their earlier shock giving way to dread. The Graham family's fractures were more evident than ever, and with the supernatural shadows creeping closer, it was clear that the worst was yet to come. The silence that followed the argument was thick, almost unbearable. Marcus's chair creaked as he leaned back, his heavy breaths audible over the distant murmurs of the remaining mourners. Lily's hands shook as she adjusted the folds of her dress, a vain attempt to regain composure. David, ever the composed pillar, finally broke the stillness. "We should focus on Father," he said, his voice low. "That's what tonight is about," but Marcus smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Focus on him, or focus on pretending everything's fine." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Father wasn't as perfect as you all like to think." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even Father Samuel looked momentarily startled. Lily's face blanched, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed, her voice trembling. Marcus's smile widened. "Oh, nothing." He swirled the remaining whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching the faint candlelight. "Just saying, maybe our saintly patriarch had a few skeletons in his closet." David's patience snapped. "That's enough. If you can't control yourself, then leave." "We don't need your poison tonight." Marcus stood, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Maybe I should," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Leave you all to your little fantasy world before anyone could stop him." He stormed toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, the lights flickered violently. A loud crash of thunder shook the house, and the room plunged into darkness. The mourners screamed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of panic. The faint glow of the candles was the only light, casting distorted shadows on the walls. And then, in the dimness, the black cat's eyes gleamed once more, brighter than before, like twin embers in the night. A guttural growl echoed through the room. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else entirely. Father Samuel's voice broke through the chaos, steady and commanding. "Everyone, stay where you are. Do not move." But Marcus, defiant as ever, ignored him. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, his voice rising in fear. He turned back toward the room, his expression wild. And then the coffin shifted. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The heavy oak casket, still sealed moments ago, now moved as if something within it was stirring. The sound of wood scraping against wood was deafening in the oppressive silence. David grabbed Lily, pulling her back. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. The growling grew louder, reverberating through the room. And then, with a final, resounding crack, the coffin lid slid open. Part 3. The black cat appears. The storm outside reached a crescendo, its winds screaming through the cracks of the old Graham house like vengeful spirits. Rain lashed against the windows, the sound merging with the mournful chants of Father Samuel as he tried to steady the room's frayed nerves. Yet, despite his efforts, the air within the house felt oppressive, thick with a tension that even the most stoic could not ignore. As Lily sat frozen beside her father's coffin, her mind raced through Marcus's earlier accusations. But her thoughts were interrupted by an unsettling sound of faint scratching at the window. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The candle's flickering light created shadows that seemed to move on their own, dancing on the walls like malevolent specters. A sudden crash shattered the fragile silence. The mourners jumped, several letting out startled cries. A gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing half the candles and plunging the space into a murky half-darkness. Lily's heart pounded as her gaze darted toward the source of the noise. There, perched on the windowsill, was a black cat. Its fur was drenched, and its eyes two glowing orbs of molten gold fixed on the coffin. For a moment, no one moved. The room seemed to hold its breath, the storm outside fading into a distant roar. "The cat. It's a bad omen," an elderly villager whispered, clutching a rosary. "A black cat crossing the dead. It's a sign of unrest." Before anyone could react, the cat leapt from the windowsill and landed gracefully atop the coffin. Its presence was almost regal, its movements deliberate. It circled the coffin once, its claws clicking softly against the polished wood, before sitting squarely at the center. The room erupted in a mixture of gasps and murmurs. "Get it out of here," Marcus shouted, breaking the stunned silence. He rose unsteadily to his feet, his face twisted in anger and fear. But as he took a step forward, the cat hissed, its back arching, its golden eyes narrowing into slits. The sound was low and guttural, more a growl than a hiss, and it froze Marcus in his tracks. "Wait," Father Samuel said, raising a hand to stop Marcus. His voice, though calm, carried a weight of unease. "We must not act rashly, Marcus spat. "It's a damn cat." "What are you so afraid of?" The priest didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the creature, his hand trembling slightly as he clutched his rosary. "There are stories," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Old stories. A black cat crossing a coffin. It can invite unwelcome spirits," Marcus scoffed, but the rest of the room's occupants exchanged nervous glances. Superstition ran deep in the village, and though many dismissed it outwardly, none dared to tempt fate. The cat, seemingly emboldened by the priest's hesitation, began to paw at the coffin's lid, its movements slow and deliberate. Each scrape of its claws sent chills down the spines of the mourners. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, stepping forward again. But as he reached for the cat, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the remaining candles. The darkness was complete, save for the faint glow of the cat's eyes, which seemed to burn brighter in the absence of light. A piercing scream shattered the darkness. It came from one of the mourners, a young woman who had been sitting near the coffin. "The lid." "It moved," she cried, her voice high and panicked. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She strained her eyes in the dark, her heart hammering in her chest. And then she saw a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The heavy oak lid of the coffin, which had been sealed just hours before, now sat slightly ajar. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't," David warned, pulling her back. His grip on her arm was firm, but she barely felt it. Her entire being was focused on the coffin and the creature atop it. The cat's gaze never wavered. It remained motionless, its eerie eyes locked onto the growing gap in the lid. Father Samuel began to pray, his voice rising above the sound of the storm. "Deliver us, O Lord, from every evil," he intoned, his words shaking. But the lid moved again, this time more noticeably. A collective gasp rippled through the room as a cold, unnatural draft seeped from the coffin, carrying with it the faintest hint of decay. The cat leapt down from the coffin with a fluid grace, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The mourners, now frozen in fear, watched as the lid of the coffin creaked open wider. Marcus, for all his bravado, took a step back, his face pale. And then, from within the coffin, a sound emerged, a low, guttural growl that was neither human nor animal. It resonated through the room, sending a wave of terror that left the mourners rooted in place. Lily clung to David, her nails digging into his arm as tears streamed down her face. "Father," she whispered again, but deep down she knew the answer. Whatever was inside that coffin was not her father. The lid fell fully open with a deafening crack. What lay inside was shrouded in darkness, but the outline of a figure began to stir. A hand, pale and skeletal, emerged from the shadows, its fingers curling and uncurling with unnatural precision. The growling grew louder, joined now by a series of wet, labored breaths. "Back away," Father Samuel shouted, his voice commanding. He held up his rosary, the small crucifix gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Everyone, back away." But before anyone could move, the figure within the coffin sat upright. Its head turned slowly, unnaturally, until its hollow eyes locked onto Marcus. A voice, low and distorted, emanated from the figure. "You betrayed me," Marcus stumbled backward, his expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, I didn't." The figure began to rise, its movements jerky and wrong, as though controlled by invisible strings. The mourners screamed, scrambling for the door, but the storm outside raged on, sealing them within the nightmare. And as the black cat's glowing eyes appeared once more in the corner of the room, it became clear that the night's horrors were far from over. Part 4. The coffin stirs. The oppressive silence in the room was shattered by a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It started as a low creak, like the groan of ancient wood under pressure. emanating from the direction of the coffin. Every head turned toward the source, eyes wide with dread. The storm outside raged on, a deafening backdrop to the growing terror inside the Graham household. Lily froze, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Her trembling hands clutched David's arm as she whispered. "Did you hear that I did?" he replied, his voice barely audible, his gaze locked on the coffin. The room, dimly lit by the flickering candles, seemed to shrink as the sound grew louder, a rhythmic tapping from within the sealed box. Father Samuel stepped forward, holding his rosary with both hands. "Stay calm," he urged, though his voice betrayed a quiver. "It might be. It must be the wind. These old houses creak in storms, but the sound wasn't that of a house. It was deliberate. Calculated, a series of thuds, then scratching, as if something inside the coffin was trying to escape." The mourners exchanged panicked glances. The elderly woman clutching her rosary whispered, "It's a sign of unrest." "Enough," Marcus bellowed, his voice breaking the tension momentarily. He staggered toward the coffin, his steps unsteady. "This is absurd. It's just a trick of the mind." Lily grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't," she pleaded. "You don't know what's happening." He shook her off, glaring at her. "What's happening is that you're all losing your minds." But as he reached the coffin, another sound erupted from within. It was unmistakable now, a groaning noise, deep and guttural, as if the dead man inside was trying to speak. Father Lily's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. She took a hesitant step closer, but David pulled her back. "Stay away," he commanded, his protective instincts kicking in. His eyes darted to Father Samuel, who had begun reciting prayers under his breath, his voice growing louder and more desperate with each word. "Deliver us, O Lord, from every evil," the priest intoned, his voice echoing against the walls. "Protect us from the darkness that seeks to harm." The coffin shifted. The movement was slight but undeniable. Gasps erupted from the mourners, and several people moved toward the door, their instincts urging them to flee. But the storm outside was relentless, the howling wind and pounding rain sealing them in with whatever horror was unfolding. The lid of the coffin, once sealed so tightly, now sat slightly askew. A chilling draft seeped from the gap, carrying with it a foul stench of decay. Marcus took a step back, his bravado faltering. This isn't real," he muttered, his voice shaking. "It can't be." Lily clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Father, please. If it's you, give us a sign." But the response that came was far from what she had hoped. A loud, sharp knock echoed from within the coffin, followed by another groan, this time louder, more anguished. And then, to everyone's horror, the lid began to lift. "No!" Father Samuel cried, stepping forward. He held up his crucifix, his hand shaking. "In the name of God, I command you to stay." The lid fell open with a deafening crack, revealing the dark interior of the coffin. What emerged first was a pale, skeletal hand, its fingers curling and uncurling as if testing their movement. The room erupted in screams, mourners scrambling to distance themselves from the horrifying sight. The figure inside the coffin began to rise. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though some unseen force was pulling it upright. When its face came into view, a collective gasp rippled through the room. The visage of Mr. Graham, once serene in death, was now twisted into a grotesque mockery of life. His hollow eyes glowed faintly, and his mouth moved as if attempting to form words. "Back away," Father Samuel shouted, his voice commanding but tinged with fear. He sprinkled holy water toward the coffin, the droplets sizzling as they landed on the rising figure. Marcus stood frozen, his face pale as death. The figure turned its head toward him, its movements sharp and mechanical. A low, distorted voice emanated from the creature. "You betrayed me." "No," Marcus whispered, shaking his head violently. "No, I didn't. I tried to." His words faltered as the creature began to move toward him, its steps slow but deliberate. "Protect us, O Lord," Father Samuel prayed loudly, his voice desperate. He held the crucifix high, but the figure didn't stop. The mourners huddled together, their screams filling the room as the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned. Lily clung to David, her body trembling. "What's happening?" she sobbed. "Why is this happening?" David pulled her close, shielding her with his body. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice grim. "But we need to get out of here." The black cat reappeared, its glowing eyes watching from the shadows. It let out a low, chilling growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The creature paused, its head turning toward the sound. For a brief moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if recognizing the cat's presence. Taking advantage of the distraction, Father Samuel stepped closer, chanting with renewed vigor. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I banish you back to the darkness from which you came." The figure let out an unearthly screech, its body convulsing. The room shook violently, the candles extinguishing one by one. The mourners cowered, their hands covering their ears as the sound grew unbearable. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the figure collapsed back into the coffin. The lid slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The storm outside began to subside, the wind dying down to a mournful whisper. For a long moment, no one moved. The room was silent except for the ragged breaths of the mourners. Father Samuel lowered his crucifix, his hands trembling. "It's over," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "For now." But as the black cat disappeared into the night, its glowing eyes the last thing to fade, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of their nightmare. Part 5. The dead walks again. The storm continued to howl outside, battering the walls with a relentless fury that seemed almost alive. Inside the Graham household, the oppressive silence following the coffin's initial stirring became suffocating, leaving the mourners paralyzed in dread. Yet, there was no denying what they had heard, a deliberate, rhythmic thud coming from within the coffin. Father Samuel, his face pale but resolute, stepped forward, his hand tightly clutching the rosary. "Everyone stay calm," he said, though his voice quivered with uncertainty. "Stay back." A faint groan emanated from the coffin, low and guttural, as though something within was struggling against its confinement. The sound sent ripples of panic through the room. Lily clung to David, her breath coming in ragged gasps. What is happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus, pale and trembling himself, moved forward despite Lily's protests. "This isn't real," he muttered, shaking his head. "It can't be. Someone's playing a sick joke." "Marcus, stop," Lily pleaded, her voice breaking, but he paid her no heed. His eyes remained locked on the coffin, his disbelief warring with fear. The lid of the coffin creaked open, just a fraction, releasing a nauseating stench of decay that filled the room. Several mourners gagged, while others backed away, their faces etched with horror. A skeletal hand emerged from the gap, its bony fingers curling as if testing the air. Then the lid lifted further, and the figure of Mr. Graham slowly rose. The sight was grotesque. His body, once still in death, now moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as though an unseen puppeteer controlled his every step. His head hung at an odd angle, and his hollow, glowing eyes scanned the room before locking onto Marcus. "You betrayed me," the figure rasped, its voice distorted, unrecognizable as human. The accusation froze Marcus in place. He stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him. "No," he stammered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't. I tried to help you. I swear." The figure stepped out of the coffin, its movements stiff yet purposeful. It pointed a skeletal finger directly at Marcus. "Lies," it growled, the word reverberating through the room like thunder. Father Samuel raised his crucifix, stepping forward, despite his trembling hands. "In the name of the Lord, I command you to return to your rest," he shouted, his voice filled with both fear and conviction. He began to recite prayers, the words rising above the storm's roar. The figure recoiled slightly at the sight of the crucifix, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, it hesitated, its movements faltering. But then it let out an unearthly screech that shook the very walls of the house. Windows rattled violently, and the candles flickered as though struggling to stay alight. Lily broke free from David's protective grip, tears streaming down her face. "Father," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please. It's me, Lily. We love you. We didn't mean for this to happen." The creature's head turned sharply toward her, its hollow gaze softening for a fleeting moment. But the reprieve was brief. The black cat reappeared, its glowing eyes fixed on the undead Mr. Graham. It hissed, low and menacing, its fur bristling as it arched its back. The figure began to convulse violently, its body twisting and contorting in ways that seemed to defy nature. A guttural roar erupted from its mouth, filling the room with a sound that was both terrifying and mournful. The mourners huddled together, too afraid to move. "By the power of the Holy Trinity, I banish you back to the darkness," Father Samuel declared, his voice ringing with newfound strength. He sprinkled holy water onto the figure, the droplets sizzling and hissing as they made contact. The creature screamed in agony, its form beginning to dissolve into a thick, black smoke that filled the room with the acrid stench of burning flesh. The walls shook, and a deafening roar erupted as the figure disintegrated completely, leaving only silence in its wake. When the smoke cleared, the room was eerily still. The storm outside had begun to wane, the howling winds reduced to a faint whisper. The black cat was gone, its glowing eyes no longer piercing the darkness. Lily collapsed into David's arms, her body racked with sobs. Marcus remained on the floor, his face buried in his hands as he muttered incoherently. Father Samuel lowered his crucifix, his hands trembling but steady. "It is finished," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The mourners began to gather themselves, their whispers carrying the same unspoken fear. The house, once filled with grief, now felt hollow and haunted, as though something essential had been stripped away. But as the last candle flickered and went out, an unshakable dread lingered in the hearts of all present. Though the creature had vanished, the storm had left behind a mark, one that would not be easily erased. And deep in the shadows, unseen by all, the black cat's eyes gleamed faintly once more before fading into the void. Part 6. Chaos and Terror. The air inside the Graham house turned icy as the storm's wrath intensified. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, and the walls trembled under the force of the wind. The unnatural silence that followed the creature's disintegration was shattered by an eerie, bone-chilling growl that echoed through the room. The remaining mourners, already trembling from the night's horrors, found themselves rooted in place, unable to flee but unwilling to stay. The black cat reappeared, darting across the room with uncanny speed. Its glowing eyes locked onto the shadows at the far corner, where the remnants of the black smoke had dissipated. A faint whisper seemed to emanate from the very walls, an indecipherable yet malevolent murmur that made every hair on the back of Lily's neck stand on end. Suddenly, the candles were extinguished all at once. Darkness descended, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself had become a living entity, swallowing all light and hope. Screams erupted as the mourners stumbled in the pitch black, their panic rising to a fever pitch. Chairs and tables crashed to the ground as people scrambled to find the exit, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. "Everyone, stay together," Father Samuel bellowed, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. But his words were in vain. A mournful wail, long, low, and filled with despair, rose from the center of the room, freezing everyone in their tracks. It was a sound no living being could make. Lily David's voice cut through the chaos as he searched for her in the darkness. He reached out, finding her trembling hand and pulling her close. "We need to get out of here," he whispered urgently, his grip firm but gentle. I can't move," Lily stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Tears streamed down her face, her body paralyzed with fear. A sudden, deafening crash came from the direction of the coffin. The sound of splintering wood was followed by an unearthly roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. A faint, flickering light returned, not from the candles, but from the hollow, glowing eyes of a figure standing amidst the wreckage of the shattered coffin. The creature had returned. It was no longer bound by the form of Mr. Graham. Instead, it had twisted into something far more monstrous. Its limbs were elongated and skeletal, its movements unnaturally fluid yet jarring. A deep, guttural growl emanated from its chest, as it began to advance toward the mourners. The panic reached its apex. Mourners screamed and pushed against one another, desperate to escape. The front door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, as if the house itself had sealed them inside. A young woman clawed at the door, sobbing, her nails breaking as she tried to pry it open. "It won't let us leave," Father Samuel muttered, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He stepped forward, holding his crucifix high. "In the name of the Holy Trinity, I command you to leave this place." The creature stopped abruptly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle to regard the priest. It let out a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the room. With a sudden violent motion, it swung its elongated arm, sending a wave of force that knocked Father Samuel off his feet. "No!" Lily cried out, breaking free from David's hold to rush toward the fallen priest. She knelt beside him, her trembling hands pressing against his shoulder. "Are you all right?" Father Samuel groaned, his voice weak but determined. "It's not just a creature. The house. It's alive. It's feeding on our fear." David grabbed Lily, pulling her back as the creature turned its gaze toward them. Its glowing eyes burned with malice, and it began to advance again, its movements fluid and predatory. The black cat darted in front of it, hissing and swiping its claws, but the creature swatted it aside with ease. "Upstairs," David shouted, dragging Lily toward the staircase. "We need to get out of its reach." "But the others," Lily protested, glancing back at the mourners who were still cowering against the walls. "I'll come back for them," David promised, his voice resolute. "But I need to keep you safe first." The two of them ascended the creaking staircase, the sound of their footsteps drowned out by the guttural growls of the creature below. The black cat, seemingly unfazed by its earlier defeat, bounded up the stairs after them, its glowing eyes now a beacon in the darkness. The upstairs hallway was narrow and claustrophobic, the storm outside casting fleeting shadows through the cracked windows. David pushed open the nearest door and ushered Lily inside. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice firm. "Don't come out until I say so." "No. Don't leave me," Lily cried, clutching his arm. Her eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "I'll be back," David promised, placing a hand on her cheek. "I swear I'll come back." Before she could protest further, he shut the door and turned to face the hallway. The creature's growls were growing louder, its presence palpable even before it came into view. David braced himself, his fists clenched. He had no weapon, no plan, but he knew he had to buy time for Lily and the others. The creature emerged at the end of the hallway, its form even more grotesque in the dim light. Its glowing eyes bore into David, and it let out a low, menacing growl. David took a step forward, his jaw set. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Come after me." As the creature advanced, the black cat darted past David, positioning itself between him and the monstrosity. It let out another hiss, its back arched, as though daring the creature to attack. For a brief moment, the creature paused, its head tilting in what could only be described as curiosity. Downstairs, Father Samuel struggled to his feet, his hand still clutching the crucifix. He began chanting prayers once more, his voice rising with each word. The mourners, seeing his determination, began to join in, their collective voices forming a shield against the darkness. The creature let out a screech, its focus divided between the voices below and the man standing defiantly in its path. David took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Let's finish this," he whispered, stepping forward. The house seemed to shudder as the battle between light and darkness continued. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the real tempest had only just begun. Part 7. The priest's intervention. The storm battered the house with renewed ferocity, as if the forces of nature itself were drawn into the battle within. Father Samuel stood amidst the chaos, his once steady hands trembling but resolute. He tightened his grip on his crucifix, the worn edges digging into his palm. Around him the mourners cowered, their fear palpable, feeding the oppressive darkness that seemed to envelop the house. The creature, its elongated form swaying unnaturally, turned its glowing eyes toward the priest. The black cat sat perched in the shadows, its luminous gaze fixed on the confrontation. It seemed to be waiting, its presence both ominous and strangely reassuring, like a silent arbiter of the events unfolding. Father Samuel drew a deep breath, summoning every ounce of faith he had. In the name of the Almighty he began, his voice echoing through the room. I command you to reveal your true nature and depart from this sacred place. The creature let out a guttural laugh, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It stepped closer, its twisted limbs moving with eerie fluidity. The mourners cried out, retreating further into the shadows. One man attempted to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing them all inside. It's feeding on our fear, Father Samuel muttered to himself, the realization hitting him like a cold wave. He raised his crucifix higher, holding it steady despite the tremor in his hands. This house belongs to God, he declared, his voice firm. No darkness shall prevail here, the creature hissed, recoiling slightly, but the air around it seemed to thicken, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The black cat let out a low growl, its back arching as it stepped closer to the priest. It stopped just short of him, its glowing eyes now fixed on the creature, as though challenging it directly. Father Samuel took this as a sign to continue. He reached into his robes and retrieved a small vial of holy water. You have no power here, he cried, uncorking the vial and flinging the water toward the creature. The droplets sizzled on contact, releasing a hiss of smoke that filled the room with an acrid stench. The creature let out a piercing screech, its body convulsing violently. It's working, one of the mourners whispered, hope flickering in their voice. But the battle was far from over. The creature's form began to shift, its skeletal frame contorting and elongating further. It lunged toward the priest, its claw-like hands swiping through the air with deadly precision. Father Samuel stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the attack. His prayers grew louder, more fervent, as he retreated toward the altar. Lily David's voice rang out from the staircase. He had returned, his face pale but determined. He glanced at the scene unfolding below, and then back at Lily, who stood frozen at the top of the stairs. Stay there, he ordered before rushing down to join the priest. The creature turned its attention to David, its glowing eyes narrowing. It let out another unearthly screech, its movements growing more erratic. The black cat darted between them, its lithe body moving with impossible speed. It leapt onto the creature's back, clawing and biting at its twisted form. The creature howled in rage, flailing wildly as it tried to dislodge the feline. Father Samuel seized the opportunity. He knelt before the altar, placing the crucifix on the ground and spreading his arms wide. Heavenly Father, he intoned, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. I call upon your divine power to banish this darkness and protect these souls. Deliver us from evil and cleanse this house of its corruption. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the few remaining candles. The only light came from the creature's glowing eyes and the faint, ethereal glow that now surrounded the priest. The mourners fell silent, their eyes fixed on Father Samuel as he continued his prayer. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting roar and lunged toward the priest. But before it could reach him, a blinding light erupted from the crucifix on the altar. The light engulfed the room, burning away the shadows and forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The creature writhed and screamed, its form disintegrating into ash as the light consumed it. When the light faded, the house was silent. The storm outside had ceased, leaving only the faint sound of raindrops tapping against the windows. The mourners slowly began to rise, their faces etched with disbelief and relief. Father Samuel remained on his knees, his head bowed and his breathing labored. The black cat approached him, its movements slow and deliberate. It sat at his side, its eyes now dim but watchful. For a moment the two seemed to share an unspoken understanding. It is done, the priest said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He lifted the crucifix, its surface still glowing faintly, and held it to his chest. The darkness has been banished. David rushed to Lily, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face. Around them, the mourners began to murmur, their voices filled with both gratitude and lingering fear. But as the black cat slipped back into the shadows, its glowing eyes briefly flickering one last time, An unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Was the nightmare truly over? Or had the darkness merely retreated, waiting for another chance to strike? The room fell silent, but Father Samuel could feel the residual presence of something dark. His prayers, though powerful, had only banished the entity for now. As he sat on his knees, his fingers grazed the edges of his crucifix. The once glowing symbol was now cool and lifeless, as if drained from the night's battle. He turned his gaze toward the black cat, which had settled at the foot of the altar. Its luminous eyes locked onto his with an expression that almost seemed to carry a warning. Lily broke the silence, her voice shaky. "What was that, Father? What did we just face?" Father Samuel sighed heavily. An entity, perhaps older than any of us could comprehend. It latched onto the fear and the sorrow within this house. Your father's death. It was merely the gateway. David's brow furrowed. Gateway? Are you saying it's not over? The priest stood slowly, leaning against the altar for support. The darkness is gone for now, but evil does not simply disappear. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to return. Tonight we were lucky. Faith and light prevailed. The mourners exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier relief replaced with a growing unease. The storm outside had calmed to a gentle drizzle, but the tension in the room remained thick, as though the walls themselves held on to the fear of the night. The black cat finally rose, its sleek body slipping into the shadows once again. Its glowing eyes were the last to vanish, their piercing light fading into the darkness. Father Samuel watched its departure with a mixture of unease and respect. That creature, he murmured. It was no ordinary cat. It was both witness and participant in this battle. David held Lily tightly as they followed the priest's gaze to where the cat had disappeared. "Do you think it was protecting us?" Lily asked softly. Father Samuel hesitated before nodding. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was ensuring the balance was maintained. Only time will tell. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the boarded windows, the house began to feel less oppressive. The mourners, though exhausted and shaken, started to rise and gather their belongings. They filed out quietly, their whispers carried by the early morning breeze. Yet each of them left with the same lingering question: was the nightmare truly over? Part 8. A haunting revelation. By the time dawn broke, the storm had retreated, leaving the Graham household cloaked in a heavy, unnatural stillness. Pale streaks of sunlight pushed through the tattered curtains, illuminating the aftermath of the night's horrors. The air smelled of ash and damp wood, the remnants of the battle fought mere hours ago. The mourners, once huddled in terror, were gone. Most had fled into the night, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness that had consumed the house. Only the family remained, their faces pale and haunted, their eyes reflecting a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. In the center of the room, the coffin lay in ruins. Splintered wood and shards of brass lay scattered across the floor. Mr. Graham's reanimated body, twisted and grotesque in its final moments, had crumbled to the ground, lifeless once more. His hollow eyes stared upward, vacant yet somehow accusatory. Lily knelt beside him, her trembling hands brushing against his cold, brittle fingers. "Father," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at his contorted expression, searching for some semblance of the man she had loved. But there was nothing. Only the faint echo of his voice, accusing Marcus of betrayal, played in her mind. David placed a firm hand on her shoulder, gently pulling her back. "Lily, you need to rest," he said, his voice low and steady. "He's gone now." Truly gone. Father Samuel stood by the altar, his gaze fixed on the shattered crucifix in his hands. The once brilliant light that had engulfed the room during the ritual was now extinguished, leaving only a faint warmth on the metal. He let out a weary sigh and turned to face the family. "This was no ordinary evil," he said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "It was ancient, older than anything I've ever encountered. Your father's death wasn't the cause, it was the catalyst. Something in this house, something in your family's past, called to it." Lily's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face etched with confusion. "Our past? What are you talking about?" The priest hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers. Curses, unresolved wrongs, sins buried but never absolved. Evil needs a door and someone. Or something. Open it. Marcus, who had been silent since the creature's final collapse, suddenly spoke. His voice was low and filled with guilt. It was me, he muttered, his hands trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Lily stared at him, her eyes narrowing. What did you do, Marcus? I didn't betray him, Marcus cried, his voice cracking. But I made mistakes. I borrowed money, and when I couldn't pay it back, I sold part of the family land that Father swore we'd never give away. He found out, and he couldn't forgive me. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air. David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he struggled to contain his anger. You broke his trust, he said through gritted teeth. You let your greed destroy this family. Father Samuel raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. What's done is done. But Marcus's actions may have stirred something dormant. This isn't just about land or money, it's about what that land holds. Curses often cling to places, to objects, and to bloodlines. Lily's breath hitched. A curse? You think we're cursed? The priest nodded solemnly. It's possible. There are whispers in the village, stories of your family's ancestors and the land they claimed. Some say it was taken by force, that blood was spilled to secure it. That's ridiculous, David snapped, his voice sharp. Superstitions and rumors. They don't mean anything, don't they? Father Samuel countered, his gaze piercing. What happened here last night wasn't natural. It wasn't a figment of your imagination. Something ancient and vengeful was awakened, and it won't rest easily. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind outside. The black cat reappeared, slinking through the shadows with its luminous eyes fixed on the priest. It stopped by the coffin, sitting silently as if guarding the patriarch's remains. Lily shuddered. What do we do now? Father Samuel approached her, his expression grave. You need to uncover the truth. Whatever sins were committed in your family's past, they must be acknowledged and atoned for. Only then can you hope to break the cycle. Marcus looked up, his face pale and stricken. And if we don't, the priest's silence was answer enough. By the time the villagers arrived later that morning, drawn by whispers of the previous night's events, the Graham house was a shell of its former self. The once pristine living room was littered with debris, and the lingering stench of smoke and decay hung in the air. The villagers exchanged hushed words as they surveyed the scene. I told you, one old woman murmured, clutching her shawl tightly. That family's cursed. Always has been, another man agreed. They say their great-grandfather cheated a neighbor out of his land. The man cursed them with his dying breath. Lily overheard the whispers, her stomach twisting with unease. Could it be true? Could the sins of her ancestors have brought this horror upon them? She turned to Father Samuel, her voice trembling. What if we can't find the truth? What if it's lost to time? The priest placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. The truth has a way of revealing itself, even when buried. But you must be willing to face it. No matter how painful. Marcus sank into a chair, his head in his hands. It was my fault, he muttered again, his voice barely audible. I sold the land, knowing it would destroy him. I should have listened. The priest's gaze softened. Perhaps your actions were the spark. But curses don't cling to individuals, they root themselves in what has already been tainted. This goes beyond you, Marcus. As the first rays of sunlight illuminated the wreckage, the family stood together, their bonds frayed but unbroken. The black cat watched from a distance, its glowing eyes a silent reminder that the battle was far from over. And as the villagers left, their whispers fading into the morning air, the Graham family resolved to confront their past no matter the cost. The dawn brought no peace, only questions. Somewhere deep in the house, a faint creak echoed through the halls, followed by the rustle of unseen movement. David exchanged a glance with Lily, who clutched her father's rosary tightly. The shadows lingered longer than they should have, as if the house itself refused to let go of its secrets. And in the silence that followed, the black cat's eyes gleamed one last time, before disappearing into the depths of the house, leaving behind a chilling sense of unfinished business. Part 9. Lingering shadows. The early morning sunlight cast long golden beams through the shattered windows of the Graham house, illuminating the wreckage of the night before. Yet, despite the dawn's arrival, the heavy pall of unease refused to lift. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the broken glass, felt laden with unseen eyes and unspoken truths. Lily sat near the remnants of the ruined coffin, her father's rosary clutched tightly in her hands. The once polished beads were now dulled by her constant grip, their cool surface grounding her in the face of overwhelming fear. Her tear-streaked face bore a hardened determination. She had spent the night grappling with questions that refused to leave her mind. "What happened to us?" she murmured, her voice breaking the silence. "What did we do to deserve this?" David crouched beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We'll find out," he said firmly. "Together. Whatever it takes, we'll get to the bottom of this." Father Samuel stood by the doorway, his expression somber. The priest's presence, though comforting, carried the weight of what they all now suspected, that the events of the night were only the beginning. "The truth is buried in your family's past," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on Lily. "You have to be willing to uncover it, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be." Marcus sat alone in the corner, his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs, the burden of guilt pressing heavily on him. "I brought this on us," he said hoarsely, his voice muffled. "Father hated me for what I did. I broke his heart. I destroyed everything." "No," Lily said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. "This isn't just about you, Marcus. It's about all of us. Whatever curse or darkness haunts our family, it's bigger than your mistakes. And we're going to face it together." Her words, though resolute, did little to ease the tension. The house itself seemed to groan in response, the creaking wood and faint rustles of unseen movement reminding everyone that the battle was far from over. The black cat, which had been a silent observer throughout the night, was nowhere to be found. Its absence left an unsettling void, as though it had taken with it the last shred of protection they had. The villagers, who had braved their curiosity to come and inspect the aftermath, whispered among themselves outside. They lingered near the property's edge, their gazes flitting between the house and the horizon. "I heard the land itself is cursed," one man said. "It's been in that family for generations, hasn't it?" An elderly woman replied. "And they say their great-grandfather stole it from a neighbor. Murdered him, even. His blood cries out from the earth, they say." Lily overheard the murmurs through the open window, her chest tightening. Could these rumors be true? Had her family's past truly sown the seeds of the darkness that now haunted them? She turned to Father Samuel, her voice trembling but resolute. "If there's truth to what they're saying, how do we find it?" The priest's expression was grave. "The land holds memories. It carries the weight of what has been done upon it. If your ancestors wronged someone, their pain may still linger. You'll need to seek out the oldest records, speak to those who remember the stories. And you must be ready to confront whatever you uncover." David stood, his jaw set. "We'll start with the village records," he said. "There has to be something, documents, deeds, anything that can tell us the truth. And if we don't find anything," Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Father Samuel's gaze darkened. "Then the curse will fester, feeding on your fear and your pain. It may retreat for a time, but it will return. Stronger." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. Lily tightened her grip on the rosary, the beads pressing into her palm. "We'll find the truth," she said firmly. "And we'll end this, no matter what it takes." As the family began to make plans, a faint noise interrupted them, a soft, rhythmic tapping from the far corner of the room. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. The shadows in the corner seemed to ripple, shifting as though something unseen moved within them. David stepped forward cautiously, his body tense. "It's nothing," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Just the wind," but Lily wasn't so sure. The black cat's absence, the eerie silence of the house, and the lingering sense of unease all pointed to one conclusion: the darkness wasn't finished with them yet. Hours later, as the sun began its slow descent, the Graham family ventured into the village. The townspeople avoided their gaze, their whispers following the family like a shadow. In the town's small archive, They sifted through yellowed pages and crumbling ledgers, searching for any mention of their land's history. It was Lily who found a faded record tucked at the back of an ancient ledger. The document detailed a dispute between her great-grandfather and a neighboring farmer over a parcel of land. The farmer had accused him of theft, claiming the land had been taken through deceit. The matter had never been resolved. The farmer had died under mysterious circumstances soon after. Lily's hands trembled as she read the account aloud. The room seemed to grow colder with every word. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what started it." Father Samuel nodded grimly. "A wrong left unrighted festers. You'll need to make amends not just for the act itself, but for the pain it caused." "But how?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "The man's dead. The land's been ours for generations. What can we possibly do?" The priest's expression softened. "Sometimes acknowledgement is enough. Return what you can. Honor the memory of those who were wronged. And most importantly, seek forgiveness not just from the spirits but from each other." As the family left the archive, the weight of their task pressed heavily upon them. The black cat, still nowhere to be seen, left an unspoken question lingering in their minds. Was it truly over? Or was this only the beginning of a new nightmare? Back at the house, Lily stood at the edge of the property, the rosary clutched tightly in her hand. She stared out at the horizon, where the first stars of the evening began to appear. "We'll fix this," she whispered, as though speaking to her father's spirit. "I promise." But as she turned to rejoin her family, a faint pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness behind her, watching silently before vanishing into the night.